Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jacqueline Chow, and I currently serve as the Cecil and Ida Green Curator of Asian Art here at the Dallas Museum of Art. I would like to welcome you all to our Boshell Family Lecture Series on archaeology. The lecture title is The Camera's Candid Eye, Colonial Photography and the Arts of Adornment in Indonesia by Dr. Natasha Reichle. Drawing on the DMA's rich collection of objects of dress and adornment, this talk will focus on how archival photography helps us understand the iconography, trade, and sometimes surprising uses of Indonesian textiles in the early 1900s. For making this lecture possible, we would like to thank the Boshell Family Foundation and the DMA's Lecture Series Endowment Fund. I'm delighted to introduce our speaker, Dr. Natasha Reichle. Dr. Reichle is a curator of Southeast Asian art at the Asian Art Museum of San Francisco. Her most recent exhibitions have examined provenance and the circulation of works of art. These include moving objects, learning from local and global communities, lost at sea, art recovered from shipwrecks, and Philippine art, collecting art and collecting memories. Her recent exhibition, Weaving Stories, looked at the role textiles play in the formation of status and identity. Other exhibitions include the first major US exhibition on the arts of Bali, called Bali Art, Ritual, and Performance. She is also the author of Violence and Serenity, Late Buddhist Sculpture from Indonesia, from the University of Hawaii Press. She is currently working on an upcoming exhibition project borrowing works from the National Museum in Cambodia and featuring a masterpiece bronze Vishnu from the West Mabon in Angkor. She holds a BA in literature from Yale University and an MA and PhD in the history of art. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Natasha Reichle to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline, and thank all of you out there. I can't really see you, but I really appreciate you all coming out on this beautiful day to sit here in the dark with me and look at some beautiful things. Everyone, Jacqueline, Christina, have been so kind and welcoming, so thank you. The genesis of this talk, which is very much a work in progress, is an exhibition I did a few years ago, which looked at textiles from island Southeast Asia, as well as using colonial era photography to see what those photographs could tell us about how textiles were used and who used them. I would like to begin this talk today with this remarkable image that's in the collection of the Wereld Museum in the Netherlands. The Wereld is a consortium of 3 different Dutch museums that together have incredible holdings in the art of Indonesia, largely because of the country's centuries-long colonial history. The photo is described as headmen from Sumba with a Dutch civil servant. The photographer is unknown, and the photo is thought to come from between 1915 and 1925. Sumba is a small island in the eastern archipelago of Indonesia, one of 17,000 islands and one of the furthest south, which is situated near a group of islands with remarkable traditions in textile making. It's about 35 miles across, and you can get an idea of its size compared to the Dallas metropolitan area in the map to the right. Unlike the islands to its north, it has no active volcanoes, and the climate on the east side of the island is more like the arid climate of northern Australia than it is the more tropical islands above it. It was initially judged by the Dutch to be of very little economic value, and for this reason, they largely had a policy of non-interference on the island until the late 19th or early 20th century. Because of the island's relative isolation, the people were able to maintain their animist religion based on worship of what were called marapu, or ancestors, spirits of the land, deities connected to clans. Today, much of the island has been converted to Christianity, but ancient rituals and beliefs coexist with new ones. The importance of ancestors, heirlooms, sacred places, harvest ceremonies, and funerary rituals are still very much maintained. Dutch and Portuguese maps labeled the island as Sandalwood Island, or Pulau Cendana, after the wood that is known for its fragrance, is used in carving, is pounded into pastes for anointing images and people. It's made into oils, and it's used for incense. It was an important export to both China and India. Today, the island has been completely deforested of sandalwood. Because of that deforestation, much of Sumba is now covered by low, non-fertile savanna lands. The West has more rainfall and more agriculture. In early Dutch sources, Sumba is also called the Island of Dancing Horses, and horses were an important part of both everyday and ritual life. They also had a significant element of trade from the island. Local kings had their own herds of horses, which were needed by the Dutch colonial forces, and the Dutch would trade gold and silver for them. This gold would be transformed into important ritual adornments by the ruling nobility, and we'll see some of these objects that are in the Dallas collection later. I love this photo also because of this tiny pig. Do you see it? Well, there's a little snout there that is being carried by the man. The horses on the left are decorated with goat hair collars, as they might have been before warfare. And horses were decorated also for competitions of men with spears on horseback that occurred each year in different villages in West Sumba to mark the beginning of the planting cycle. These fights, called pasola, still exist today, but with mock battles that have become a tourist event. The other major cultural speciality of this island are traditions of building megalithic structures. Sumba is one of the few places on Earth where these practices continue to this day. The tradition is built around funerary rituals in which large stone structures are erected at the grave sites of noble individuals. These structures were often built in the centers or near traditional villages. These villages have houses with raised bases, which you can see here, in which livestock could be, and then they had these very tall roofs. While most people no longer live in villages like this, they are still the centers of ceremonial activities of the descendants of clans. Having the graves of ancestors within the village gives people the opportunity to commemorate them, give prayers and offerings in hopes for protection in return. These large flat stones can serve everyday purposes as well. Children play on them, people dry their laundry on them, crops are sorted on them. Here's a perhaps more realistic view of a traditional village in West Sumba, which were often located on the top of a hill for protection. And it shows the satellite dishes, phone wires, and tourists that make up part of contemporary life. It also shows on the right this bamboo structure of the tall, high roof of the building. And these tops of the homes were where heirlooms were stored and where ancestral spirits were believed to reside. In the background, you can see some of the tall stone structures used as grave markers. Entire communities, hundreds or even thousands of people gather to pull massive stones from quarries to serve as funerary markers in village centers. In Western Sumba, this process occurs by an individual before their death, but in Eastern Sumba, it's the responsibility of the children of the deceased. You can see here this massive stone being dragged, and also the use of textiles that serve as flags during this stone pulling process. Branches of trees are cut down and laid on the ground so the giant stone can roll over them. Here you see on the left 2 men riding on one of these stones as it's being pulled. At least one of these men is a ritual leader of the community. These stone pulling rituals are marked by the slaughter of dozens of animals whose meat is then distributed to everyone who took part. The buffalo horns shown here on the back were likely sacrificed for this event or an earlier one. The ability to afford to support all the laborers is a mark of the wealth and status of the individual sponsoring the stone pulling. Many years ago when I participated in one of these stone pullings, they even gave me some meat on a little plastic string to take back to my hotel and to give to the people working there who were very happy to find it, to have it. In this photo, you can see 2 men standing on the platform in front of the stone. It's kind of hard to make out, but they're right there. It can be very dangerous to drag a several-ton stone down a hill. Very dangerous both to the people involved in the dragging, and also if the stone breaks, the entire process has to be started anew. It's considered inauspicious and you would need to quarry a new stone. A scholar watching a process in 2007 noted it took 1,000 people over 7 hours to drag the stone a little over 2 kilometers. Today, there's also the use of trucks to pull the stones and the manufacture of gravestones from cement. But there's greater status associated with being able to command the money and the connections to pull a stone the traditional way. Graves in East Sumba often have 2 parts, a slab or a dolmen that is this big part, and then a curved upright menhir, which is called a penji in Sumba, and it's a kind of stone banner for the tomb. Both the slab and the upright portions may be carved with motifs that relate to the life or express the status of the deceased. Popular motifs include animals, gongs, and ritual jewelry. Dallas has 2 penji in its collection, the one on the left, and you can see some of these popular motifs. There's a little horse right here, a gong, a fish, and at the very top, a scorpion, and then these forms on it, which perhaps are relating or similar to the shape of the penji itself. The example on the right, the motifs are a human figure, perhaps an ancestor figure, and then this series of curling bits of a fern-like plant, and then at the very top, a small fish. A drawing from a Dutch artist who visited Sumba in the early 1900s shows perhaps over this very same penji before it was removed from the island. Megaliths take different forms on different parts of the island, and there are cultural differences between the west, which is wetter, and the east, which is much drier. There are more languages on the west, more agriculture, and many more independent traditional domains. Sumba was never unified under a single leader, but divided into these traditional regions which were ruled by local chiefs or kings. This political fragmentation contributed to the long history of intermittent warfare between these kingdoms, including the taking of heads in raids. For safety, villages were often built on hilltops with protective walls and hedges. Sumba is also an island with a history of slavery. Caste systems on the island differentiated between nobility, commoners, and enslaved people. Nobility and enslaved people lived together in a clan complex, and commoners would often live separately on the outskirts. Enslaved people were considered the possessions of the nobles and worked for them in their homes, in agriculture, and with weaving for the families. They would be fed and clothed and housed in return, and nobles would facilitate their major life events like marriages or funerary rituals. But a second system of slavery was also on the island, which were individuals that were captured by the Dutch or their proxies and sold into slavery for colonial project, working on Dutch construction projects, plantations, and in Dutch homes in the capital and elsewhere. Returning to this photo we started from, it's clear that this is a formal occasion and that these are important people. The painted backdrop, the hung curtains, and the carpeted floor suggest that it might have been taken at a photographer's studio. Although Sumba is a small island and quite rural compared to some of the other islands in Indonesia, we know that at least one professional photographer had a studio there in the early 1900s. Who are these people, and what was the occasion of this photo? I thought I might try to begin to answer this question by examining the blazing white center in the middle of this vibrant group. This man, despite his stiff white uniform with its shiny buttons and starred epaulets, he looks positively unadorned compared to the richness of the garb of the men around him. With legs crossed and holding a cigarette, he wears a dark hat with a white cotton jacket called a jas tutup, or closed jacket in Indonesian. And the reason for the introduction of his style of menswear was twofold. First, to give colonial officers and other Dutchmen in Indonesia a more comfortable outfit, rather than the dark woolen suits that they would wear in the Netherlands. These suits were made of cotton and did not require a shirt underneath. The ability to wear all white also indicated the wearer's wealth and ability to have servants to keep those white suits white. But a second purpose of this garb was for the Dutch to distinguish themselves from the Indonesians, many of whom had started adopting shirts and dark jackets when with the Dutch. You can see the use of Western-style shirts and jackets in this photo, but certainly no mimicking of Western dress as a whole. By the 1930s, so some years after that first photograph, many headmen in Sumba had taken on wearing the white jacket as well for formal occasions with the Dutch. Indonesians would face discrimination if not wearing Western clothing in schools, workplaces, restaurants. One can see in the writing of early political leaders that they internalized the colonial attitude toward Indonesian indigenous clothing and associated Western clothing with progressive ideas and advancement. The first president of Indonesia, Sukarno, wrote in his autobiography, "I suggest that in moving forward, we have to reject the use of the sarong, which is the lower garment or the sort of skirt cloth, even for personal use. This ancient native dress code has degrading consequences. The minute an Indonesian wears a pantaloon or pants, he walks up straight as white people do." This argument was countered, though, by other nationalists who argued for maintaining traditional clothing. And today there is a movement among government workers throughout the archipelago to, on certain days of the week, wear traditional clothing. Here you see a converted Christian minister in Sumba lecturing to a crowd in a small church. While you see he's wearing this white suit, the gathered crowd is in a variety of dress. The women in the back here are dressed in imported batik textiles, which by the early 1900s found their way from Java throughout the archipelago. Interestingly, though, they're wearing ritual jewelry, these earrings, which we'll come back to later in this talk. Local teachers as well adopted Western dress. Another aspect of local appearance that colonial power impacted was the widespread tradition of wearing headdresses, which were discouraged in government positions or while working with the Dutch. As well, there was an attempt to tame the hair, which would traditionally be worn long. This photograph from before 1943 shows the somewhat futile attempts to control the hair of the students in this group. Reminds me of myself every morning with my gray hairs. Indonesians were not the only ones to adopt elements of foreign dress. The Dutch, too, adopted Indonesian styles of dress, especially in their colonial homes, where sarongs were worn by both men and women in the late 19th century. Looking closely at the photo, we can pick out some elements of the dress of these Sumba headmen. If you look at each one of these circled areas, you see that they're carrying woven rattan bags under their arms. These are bags for carrying the elements of chewing betel, and here are some examples which are quite like the ones that the men are wearing, and they're from the Wereld Museum in the Netherlands. In many parts of South and Southeast Asia, people once, and in mainland Asia as well, people once chewed betel, a mild stimulant and a psychoactive substance that is thought to also act as an antidepressant. These traditions continue today in both Asia and in Asian diasporic communities around the world. In Sumba, sharing betel is a sign of hospitality and a component of welcoming friends and strangers. A betel quid often consists of the nut of an areca plant, which is cut up into these little slices or chips and mixed with the mineral lime and then wrapped in a betel leaf. Or, as you can see in the center here, a lot of the Eastern archipelago and New Guinea use this sort of flower spike of the betel plant. And these, when working together, create the stimulating and psychoactive effects of the betel nut. Containers for carrying and sharing these elements exist all throughout Southeast Asia, from royal sets made for kings out of precious materials to simpler containers made of fabric, rattan, or ceramics. A beautiful example from the Dallas collection is this beaded bag. Imported beads were rare commodities, and objects made from beads were likely made by and for nobility. A betel bag like this would have been part of the heirlooms of a high-ranking family and used on ceremonial occasions. The offering of betel was an important part not only for visitors or guests, but also a part of ritual offerings and funerary traditions. This bag features a male figure with raised hands, perhaps an ancestral figure, and we'll see this type of figure repeated in other art forms of Sumba to come. Besides beads, imports to the island from other islands and from further away, India and China, included precious metals, ivory, and porcelain. Looking closely again at the photo, we can see many of the men's right hands rest in the same position, bent low at the elbow and raised toward the chest. Their hands are resting near the smooth, bent hilt of a weapon, with a flat end that resembles the hoof of a deer. One can also see the curving wood on the top of the crossbar, kind of hard to see here, but right there, of the sheath, and the sheath itself, which is wrapped in rattan-like strips. This type of weapon is the traditional weapon of East Sumba, where it's used as a machete, but was also once used in warfare. And it's still an important part of ceremonial attire. The handles were made of wood, or sometimes walrus ivory, which was imported through various trade networks all the way from Greenland. The image on the right shows a religious specialist who is wearing the weapon here, but also in front of him, he's pounding the mineral lime for use to make into a betel quid to chew. Another element that's on the waist of several of the men in the picture is this flat wooden box with a lid. This is a tongal, a wooden pouch, which was used by men to keep their valuables, such as money, bits of gold, small containers with medicinal or magical herbs. They could also be used to carry important pieces of ritual jewelry. Some of that, again, we'll see soon. But certainly the most striking thing about the photograph is the clothing of these men from Sumba, their headdresses and shoulder cloths, each worn in a slightly different manner. It's these cloths in particular that tell us these men are nobles and come from East Sumba. Hand-dyed and woven cloths were made on both sides of the island in both West and East Sumba. Interestingly, weaving was traditionally forbidden in the center of the island. But the type of textile worn by these men and shown in this example from Dallas's collection, with these rows of patterns that are mirrored from the center, were made in East Sumba. The centers of these textiles often mimic the patterns from highly valued imported Indian textiles known as patola, while other motifs feature animals with symbolic significance in Sumbanese life, like cockatoos, deers, snake, and you see the cockatoos repeated twice here, these deers, and there's some little snakes in here, as well as ornaments like mamuli, which is this shape here, which we've seen already. The women wearing batik were wearing them, and we'll see again soon. Different weaving styles existed on different parts of the island, and even different villages could have different styles. But backstrap looms are used in both areas, as they are across much of Indonesia. But weaving is just the last step in a very complicated process. Before the introduction of commercial yarns and dyes, women were responsible for the growing and harvesting of the cotton, the spinning of the threads, the designing and tying of intricate patterns, preparing the dyes, dyeing the threads, and finally weaving the cloths. In the ikat process, bundles of threads are tied together to protect them from absorbing dye before being soaked in a dye bath. Threads would then need to be dyed multiple times to obtain deep colors, and then the protective ties untied and retied for traditional dyeing for each new color or shade. So the dyeing process could take dozens of times to get the deep colors that the weaver wanted. While archival photographs exist of the weaving process, far fewer exist of the dyeing process, which was equally, if not more, important. Techniques for preparing dyes were kept secret, and certain dyes were only made by technically and spiritually qualified women. The knowledge of the plants and the chemical processes were also valuable for preparing medicines, and often women dyers were also healers. These textiles were generally, the types we've been looking at with the ikatted patterns were called hingi, and generally woven in pairs, and worn as shoulder and waist cloths of the noble class. As you see in this example, which shows a lot of the elements we've been looking at. He has one of those tongal, he's wearing a sword, he's got his beetle bag, all elements that we've seen already. These textiles also became hugely popular with the Dutch and other tourists, and weaving these cloths became a major export for Sumba and remains so. These cloths were not only worn on ceremonial occasions, but were also important objects of ritual exchange during weddings and at funerals of the nobility. A body might be wrapped or covered in dozens to hundreds of textiles, and equal numbers brought to the funerals of attendees. This example from Dallas's collection shows a common motif, an andong or andung or skull tree, which you see down here with these ancestor figures in between. A large branch of a tree would be erected and surrounded by rocks, and sometimes, like in this photo, the horns of a buffalo. The heads of victims of warfare or criminals would be displayed on the branches. Headhunting raids of other villages could be for different reasons: honor, revenge, controlling the land or people, but displaying the heads was thought to renew health and fertility of a community. Unlike similar displays of heads in the West, and here you see heads displayed on London Bridge in the late 1700s, the heads in Sumba were often ritually treated before display. In East Sumba, they were treated with great respect, with a number of rituals before they were displayed. Here's another beautiful example from Dallas's collection of a hingi, or men's hip or shoulder cloth. We see a lot of the things we've been talking about already, these forms of snakes, birds, and then here there's this curved crescent-like motif that's repeated, oh, and also the horses. This crescent-like motif is a type of heirloom jewelry called tabello in the West, and lamba in the East. This crescent-shaped head ornament is made of thin, pounded gold, and the shape could refer not only to a crescent, but the shape of buffalo horns, perhaps, or the prows of a ship. In the center is a star-like shape, and to the either side of that, figures on horses. Both the horses and the figures are clearly gendered, and the juxtaposition of motifs thought to be masculine and those thought of feminine is seen quite often paired in the art of the region. The ornaments were worn on the forehead of noble men during important rituals, and you can see that in these two men. It was part of a set of jewelry which included this, and then these figures called mamuli, and then these long chains as a three parts that were often worn together. Dallas has some spectacular examples. We've seen these in photos already being worn as earrings, but they were elements of sacred regalia that could be worn in different ways and were exchanged in marriages and other rituals. Often at the base of these mamuli, you see either animals or plants represented, sometimes warriors. On the figure on the right, we have warriors on top of horses. And on the left, two monkeys. And again, we have gendered animals in both cases. Looking closely at the head ornament we just saw, one can see in this central star, again, the reoccurrence of this mamuli shape, which was thought to be feminine and be a womb-like shape. Here are two more elements, important objects of Sumbanese gold regalia, and these from the Asian Art Museum's collection, a kanatar or chain that we saw in the archival photograph we just saw, and a maranga or chest ornament. These ornaments would have been part of the sacred heirlooms of the lineage of a clan and kept in the tall roofs of the traditional homes, which belonged to the nobility. The maranga is only brought out for certain ritual occasions under the supervision of a priest. This photo from 1930 shows jewelry and other valuables displayed by the Raja or King of Anakalang in Sumba, West Sumba, in 1930, and is thought to date from sometime in the 1930s. Arrayed along this bamboo stick are many of the pieces we have just looked at. And one wonders, though, looking at this photo, about the context of it. Is this a ritual occasion, or is this an arrangement and display purely for a colonial photographer? Something that we don't know. It's often said that the ikatted shoulder cloths of East Sumba, the hingi, were only worn by men and as shoulder and hip cloths, but photographs prove that this was not always the case. In this photograph of three dancers, 2 of the women seem to wear hingi, and the third wears an imported batik textile from Java. It's interesting that Javanese batiks, a valued import, can be seen in several photographs being worn as shoulder cloths rather than wrapped around the torso, as they would be in Java. In this photo, a village head is with his 2 wives. The woman on the right is wearing one of these wax-resist dyed batiks from Java, and the woman on the left is wearing the article of clothing that was worn by the majority of women in Sumba, a long, thin tube skirt dyed black with mud and tannins. Early European visitors to Sumba remarked that this plain garment made from hand-spun cotton was common across the island. In this photo from 1932, you see 3 women from East Sumba dressed for a funeral, each wearing a different kind of attire. On the heads of the 2 figures on the right are combs made from turtle shell. And here's an example from Dallas's collection. These hair combs were given to young girls by their fathers when they reached puberty, and also worn by nobles and other people of status. Looking closely, one can see a skull tree here in the center with the buffalo horns down below, as well as a horse with its flying mane, a rooster, and a seated man. The photo of these 3 women show a few of the types of the tall, thin tube skirts that women wore and how they could be worn either folded at the waist or above the chest. It also illustrates the different garb of the 3 levels of society, with the women on the left wearing an undecorated, dark, mud-dyed, presumably hand-spun textile. She is an enslaved woman. On the right is a commoner wearing a mud-dyed textile decorated with beads, and in the center, a member of the nobility wearing an intricately woven textile, the wearing of which was, until the 20th century, considered a prerogative of the noble class. Dallas has a fine example of one of these beaded skirts, decorated with both beads and shells. This one showing sea life, crabs, and a big lobster-like creature in the center. These animals are associated with the origin myths of the people of Sumba. It's thought that the first people of Sumba traveled across the sea to Sumba, and on their journey saw these sea creatures. And these aquatic animals have then become associated with the ancestors. At one time, women in Sumba got tattoos, or many women in Sumba got tattoos when they reached puberty, and often the motifs found were also motifs that were found on textiles. In parts of Sumba, it was thought that a woman needed tattoos in order to be able to enter the afterlife and the world of the ancestors, and if a young girl died before being tattooed, she would be buried with the tools for tattooing. In these photos, you both see the motifs of sea creatures, a little bit hard to make out, and also, yes, weekend. Welcome to the weekend on that. The noblewoman seen here, who was the center of that triad, is wearing an decorated tube skirt that, until the mid-20th century, was almost always restricted to the noble class. It's called a lau pahitung. Dallas has several fine examples of this type of textile. Both of these display standing ancestor figures, as we've seen several times already, both on the beaded bag and on the Penji banner of the funerary stone. The example on the left is particularly nice because it combines 2 difficult techniques of patterning a textile. This is ikat down below, so this is made by tying the threads so they don't absorb the dye, and then untying and retying them, and then a different method on top of introducing supplementary warps while weaving. That technique is shown here, and it involves transferring a pattern which is kept up here, using extra warps while weaving a textile. These patterns were considered and are considered the exclusive property of noble women and were used only by them and the enslaved women who lived with them. The patterns were recorded and kept in these sort of pattern books made of sort of reeds and threads. And weavers often expressed fear of other weavers stealing their patterns, so they were kept closely guarded. While the textiles we just saw are said to have only been worn by the nobility, there are exceptions, and those exceptions are documented in early photography. This photo from 1931 shows a group of women that are attending a funeral ceremony. The woman on the far left is an enslaved woman, and for rituals like funerary rituals, enslaved members of a noble's household would wear the finest textiles and act as attendants to the deceased. It was considered that they would symbolically follow the deceased into the next life. Two more examples in the Dallas collection show motifs that we've seen before. Skull trees down here, deer again, fish, and then on the right, some kind of flatfish, ancestor figures again, and I believe horses. Although contemporary textiles show many changes, and these changes started happening in the early 1900s with the impact of the Dutch. Some Sumba weavers started incorporating many images that came to Sumba on Dutch coins and other objects that came from Europe and elsewhere. So you'll see rampant lions and other things. So although there have been many changes and contemporary life has made the everyday wear of the people of Sumba the same shirts and jeans seen across the world, traditional textiles still have a place in the ritual life and speak to the deep importance of indigenous culture still in Sumba today. As we've seen, colonial era photography of island Southeast Asia provides a wealth of information about the past, but does so through a clouded lens. What might seem at first an image of a weaver in a village, with deeper research might turn out to be a posed photograph of a woman brought to an exposition in Jakarta. How did the presence of a colonial interloper change the lives of the people photographed? How does an acknowledgement of this history change how we see these photographs? Yet these photos, both candid and staged, contain something that no writing from the period can capture. Real textiles being made by real women, garments as they were folded, tucked, tied, and draped, at moments sometimes choreographed, but also everyday and celebratory. They give us glimpses, however oblique, of worlds we cannot see anymore. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to Dr. Natasha Reichle. If you have any questions for her, feel free to raise your hand and I'll come around.
Do men and women wear the same patterns?
Menswear and traditional menswear and women's wear were quite different in form, but there are certainly repetition of the same motifs on both things.
Once you have a sarong, do you have it for life, or do you replace it with other things, or what happens?
The question was, once you have a sarong, do you wear it for life, or do you replace it with other things? Is that? I think it kind of entirely depends. A lot of the sarongs that we see, like the ones in this collection here, were probably never worn. They were probably one of the hundreds that were brought to some royal during some ritual as a gift, and then the king who got them sold them to a trader or a tourist or something like that. So many of the things that you see, and many of the sarongs that exist in the collection of nobles in Sumba today were never worn.
Yes, hi, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, a little bit of history. Can you mention something about the hats? I mean, there was something
Yeah.
really interesting there.
Oh, the hats are so amazing. And interestingly, it's something that no one has done very much research at all on, at least while I was looking. What we do know is that many of them in this indication, these headdresses, were made out of bark cloth. So they were the entirely different process of pounding a certain type of the pulp of a certain type of tree. And you make these very stiff, long, and sometimes, if they're burnished, shiny cloths. And in Sumba, that was what was used. And I've read some things about how if they're folded in certain ways with, you know, the folds going up in front, it marked you as nobility or something like that. But from an image like this, it really looks like there was a lot of individuality expressed in how you did it. But certainly headdresses are something that are super important throughout Indonesia. But not much research at all has been done on them in Sumba.
Yep. So the weavers were women?
Yes.
Cool.
Most traditional textiles in Indonesia were entirely made by women up until modern times, especially in the 20th century, late 20th century, more men started to become involved. So today you can see some men being involved.
Trade or for the international trade, I guess.
Yeah, or for other textiles like in Java with the batik, when it moved from being hand-drawn to being done with stamps, men took over or did that type of work.
And what about the dyes? Is it cochineal and indigo, or primarily?
Largely not cochineal. The red dyes, I think, primarily come from the roots of certain trees, but cochineal didn't really come into this area.
Right, it's not Eastern like that. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I'll come back.
So fascinating. Thank you. Although you're primarily interested in the textiles, do you know what they used for the stone carving?
The stone came from primarily, they have, the whole island is based on, is very rocky with lots of quarries of limestone, I think, quarries. I'd have to double check that. And so for people would go to these quarries, work out the size of stone that they, you know, wanted, and then that would be dragged from the quarries to the village and carved there.
So they had fairly advanced metalworking to do this, I imagine. Again, I know you're primarily textile, so.
I don't know. That's, I don't know the answer. It's a good question.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You'll have to come back for another lecture.
A lot of the carving is not very detailed on these monuments. It's often quite, you know, just getting the shape of a gong or the shape of a human figure. It's not polished necessarily, so I'm not sure if there was a specialized class that did the decorating. That's a very good question. I'd like to know more.
Thank you so much for your enlightening talk. I actually had two questions. First being, you mentioned that certain patterns were limited to certain groups. Was there any pattern with, say, certain colors with levels of society or different tribes? And then the second question I had was, you'd mentioned that a lot of the textiles were cotton-based. Is there any other type of textiles that they used?
I think traditional textiles were entirely cotton except for these headdresses, which were made out of bark cloth, until the 20th century, when I think imported other threads of other materials started coming into, as well as commercial dyes started coming into Sumba. I think the color red was associated largely with the ruling classes and was important distinguisher. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
So all the beautiful objects that we have here in our museum, who collected them, and how did we get so many? I mean, I've seen several exhibits. I think I have a book at home that I got a long time ago of Indonesian fabrics from here. So what's the deal on that?
I know that there was one dealer, Stephen Albert, who was very involved in a lot of the collecting, and he worked with various members of the DMA community and certain donors, but you'd have to go to Jacqueline for more specific details about the collecting.
Yes, actually, Natasha nailed it on the head for us. We were very fortunate at the Dallas Museum of Art to have a really amazing, quite well-known collection dedicated to island Southeast Asian art, including a majority of which are textiles and these wonderful accessories that Natasha featured. Yes, a lot of it was through, I think there was just a strong interest from their private collections who have always been very interested in collecting the material that we were very fortunate to receive at the museum. Also, we do have specialists like Stephen Albert, who has been dedicated to, he's actually even given pieces from his collection to us, and he's also helped advise certain collectors in Dallas who then also were interested in the material, and they ended up giving gifts to us as well. And I'm speaking over many, many decades of time. So now our collection is quite robust, as Natasha showed. So thank you. I hope would that help answer the question?
And
Yeah.
there's a whole beautiful catalog
Yes.
dedicated to it. So
Yes, the catalog I do recommend if you'd want to learn more about our particular collection. It's called Eyes of the Ancestors. It was actually maybe in its like third reprint. It was so popular. The collection may have started in the 70s, but it didn't really grow until like the 90s, 2000s, I would say, in terms of amount. Yeah, but I do recommend the catalog. You can get it on Amazon. I don't know. I think we have it in the store, but it's been through so many reprints, so I don't know if we have any in stock at the store at the moment, but I know it's available on Amazon. That's why I always share that.
Hi, so you mentioned you took part in the stone ritual.
Yeah.
I want to know how that was for you, and if you had to get in contact with anyone from the culture or tribe specifically.
This was a long, long time ago, and basically sitting in front of a little tiny hotel, and some person walked up and said, "Hey, do you want to take part in this?" And I said, "Sure." I mean, that was how it happened. It was nothing formal. It was before there was as much tourism as there is to that area. It was, kind of random. I did not pull the stone. Men did that, I walked with the women. Yeah.
Very serendipitous.
Well, thank you so much to Dr.
you.
Natasha Reichle, and to our Boshell Lecture Series Foundation. And thank you all to coming out here and spending your Saturday with us. We appreciate it. And come back for another one.